Hello and welcome to Wellbeing. I'm Jack Hodgins. Today I'll be discussing viruses and the COVID pandemic. We are joined by Professor Bryan Williams, Research Group Head of Cancer and Innate Immunity at the Hudson Institute of Medical Research. Professor Williams is a distinguished scientist and international authority on innate immunity and cancer biology, having contributed his own discoveries to his field. Hello Bryan, and welcome to the program.
Hello Jack, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you Bryan. When did you first hear of COVID-19 and what were your initial reactions?
Yes, I first heard about this from one of my first PhD students, actually now a distinguished professor at the University of Toronto, who was carrying out a study in Wuhan at a hospital there, and she mentioned to me that she's a virologist and an immunologist, and she mentioned to me that they were having these unusual infections, a little bit different from just a standard influenza. And she said it's likely that this is potentially a novel coronavirus, and that was subsequently confirmed. Coincidentally, she came and visited in February, and we discussed it a little bit further, and she was constantly taking phone calls from Wuhan about the study that they were doing, and what they started to believe was that, yes, it was a little bit like seasonal flu, but perhaps a bit more serious. Feeling that we had at the time, and my discussions with her was, yes, it may be a bit more serious than flu, but let's just see how it pans out. Of course, it's turned out to be a lot more serious than seasonal flu.
What makes this virus different to any other virus?
This virus is related to the original SARS virus, where the outbreak occurred in the early 2000s. That one was mostly restricted in terms of its ability to spread effectively and efficiently. And I think this led to some mistakes early on. But it is a coronavirus, so it's a member of the coronavirus family. And its origin, of course, is still under debate. But the original SARS virus, the origin was pretty much confirmed to be in bats, and it likely jumped from bats to another host, then subsequently jumped to humans. So it's a member of that coronavirus family that then was also involved in a disease called MERS, Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome disease. That became apparent in carers of camels in the Middle East. That was also a pretty serious virus in terms of its ability to have disease that resulted in death at a pretty high rate in that population. But neither the original SARS nor MERS has developed the ability to spread so rapidly as SARS, what is now termed SARS-CoV-2.
And generally, what is a virus?
The best way to describe it is it's an intracellular parasite in a way. It has to infect a host cell. It's not able to replicate outside of a cell. And then it uses the cellular machinery to replicate, to grow, and then produce progeny, what are called virions, or virus particles. They're then able to escape from the cell and infect surrounding cells. And then, of course, they can eventually escape out into the environment and infect animals, including humans. The virus family, though, is very, very widespread. There are viruses in the oceans. There are viruses in plants. There are viruses in pretty much every living organism can have their own individual viruses. So they're very, very successful in terms of their ability to infect, as I mentioned, almost every living organism and take advantage of the machinery inside an organism to reproduce and spread.
Are viruses alive or have any consciousness of any kind?
No, not at all. They really are entirely dependent on their ability to find a particular host and then replicate within that host.
Why do you think we have viruses?
They're a very ancient life form that have developed over many millions of years and have co-evolved with all other life forms. Similar to, in some ways, to fungi and other life forms, they've found a niche within the living population to be able to establish. Of course, many viruses are not lethal. Obviously, if they're lethal, then they can pretty quickly lose their ability to infect other hosts because they run out of hosts. So there ends up being an interesting relationship there, where viruses establish themselves, can replicate, but don't necessarily kill their hosts. And that's usually the case with most viruses.
Let's talk a little bit about your career. When did you first start becoming interested in the field you now work in?
Oh, that was really as a PhD student back in New Zealand in the 1970s, so a very long time ago. I wasn't so much interested in particular viruses per se, but I was interested in cellular responses to virus infection. So what does a cell do when a virus comes along and infects it? Does a cell have any mechanisms of defense? So that was the sort of thing that interested me very early on, as I said, mentioned during my PhD studies.
How long do you expect the COVID pandemic to last? Is it going to be decade-defining?
Look, it certainly will. I mean, I think we can look at really the way we deal with seasonal flu, and I think what we'll be doing is dealing with COVID outbreak for a very long time. It's likely that these coronaviruses of the SARS variety will continue to evolve. We can see the strains that are currently running rampant and then worldwide as the Delta strain. So there'll be other strains that come along. And it will become, endemic in human populations, and we'll have to deal with this with vaccination to keep it under control. I think you can see that the way we deal with the regular seasonal flu is through regular vaccinations on an annual basis, and we will be doing the same with SARS-CoV-2.
What makes the Delta strain different to the other strains?
It's a much more efficient virus in terms of its ability to replicate. It's about 60% more infectious. Those are the estimates. So it's able to infect individuals much more efficiently and it's able to be passed from one individual to another much more effectively than the previous strains, the alpha-beta strains of the virus. And that's just the nature of things when you don't have a vaccinated population. This is why it's very important to get vaccines rolled out as soon as possible. And we were a little bit slow in Australia. But you can see even in vaccinated populations, the Delta strain is still able to infect a vaccinated individual, but those individuals don't usually get very sick and are not often hospitalized. And they don't produce anything like the same virus load as an unvaccinated individual. So you have less spread in a vaccinated population than you do in an unvaccinated population.
It sounds like with COVID that we're going to have to live with it through vaccinations, much like we do currently with the flu vaccinations.
Yes, I think vaccination is certainly what's been quite remarkable is the way vaccination has come into play so quickly. We wouldn't have imagined doing anything like this before the outbreak of this particular infection. It just took so long for vaccines to be produced. Pharmaceutical companies weren't all that interested in vaccination because it wasn't economic for them to get engaged. A lot of vaccination programs had to be funded from the public purse. But now with new technologies, particularly mRNA vaccines, this means that we can rapidly produce new vaccines in a matter of months rather than years. And that's the way that we will be able to keep on top of this virus. But having said that, I think it's still very important to develop and work on developing drugs that also combat the virus infection. So if somebody can be detected as being infected very early on in the stage of infection, then you can have drugs that are developed that can interfere with this replicative stage of the virus. And just as an example, drugs have been developed to combat hepatitis C virus infection. It's taken a long time, but there are now efficient drugs that are able to do that. And of course, the story we all know about is drugs that were developed to combat HIV. Again, it took a very long time to develop these drugs. They're not without side effects, but they've been very, very effective in reducing the mortality and morbidity we see with HIV infections. So there needs to be a considerable amount of effort put into developing new drugs, in addition to continually modifying vaccines.
Now a year and a half into the pandemic, what are we doing well and what do we need to work on?
Well, I think finally we've got the vaccination strategy working. We were slow to begin with for a number of reasons. The government decided to only to buy in local vaccine that was a very promising vaccine out of Queensland, but unfortunately it had some issues that prevented it from developing further. And then, of course, they also, and I think quite rightly, invested in the AstraZeneca vaccine. Early on, I thought that was a very promising vaccine. And then the RNA vaccines, they really didn't invest in as much as they perhaps could have, but it's all very well looking in hindsight to this. But I think we're doing well now with the vaccine rollout, encouraging more people. The vaccine supply, particularly of AstraZeneca, there's many doses of AstraZeneca available to vaccinate the population. People just need to be encouraged to go out and get vaccinated. So I'm hoping that by the end of the year we'll have the vaccination rates will be up to a level where we can start to see a relaxation in some of the lockdowns that we're currently suffering under. Where we're not doing so well is investing in the research in Australia. I think that's been it's been a little bit slow. There's been quite a bit of activity, and research monies have been invested, and quite rightly so, in some well-known research organisations. But there are others have been sort of left in limbo a little bit. I mean, it's interesting that Australia has a very, very active virology community, but I don't see a lot of investment research dollars going into virology. I'm not a virologist. My role is in innate immunity, but I think that investment in virology research has been a little bit lacking. Could have been more investment also into vaccinology. We had the Queensland vaccine, which I mentioned, was very promising. The government invested some funds in that, but hopefully the Queensland group, I know, are continuing their research, and hopefully they'll be able to come up with a new edition of their particular vaccine that will prove successful. So we need to keep investing in those sorts of areas.
What makes the different vaccines on the market at the moment different from each other?
Just the way they're produced. So some of the vaccines have relied on a harmless virus as their backbone, if you like. That's a more traditional way, and that's the case of the AstraZeneca vaccine. The other approach with Pfizer and Moderna has been to use mRNA-based vaccines. Now, so this is messenger RNA that encodes a protein, and that particular protein is the spike protein, which is the protein that the SARS-CoV-2 virus uses to infect cells. So that's a newer type of technology, and it's been very, very successful. And the other thing about those vaccines, the messenger RNA vaccines, it's relatively easy, at least from a laboratory point of view, to introduce any mutations that occur in, say, the different variants. Now the Delta variant. It's relatively easy to introduce those, containing those mutations, introduce those into the backbone of these messenger RNAs, and then establish a new vaccine.
You're listening to Wellbeing, where we are discussing viruses and the COVID pandemic. My guest today is Professor Bryan Williams. Even though there's such strong medical evidence supporting vaccines, why do you think even in Australia are there people that are anti-vax?
There are some history lessons here that maybe these people need to be introduced to, and one of the easiest ways of doing that is to just take them along for a trip into some of the cemeteries that have graves that, particularly in the late Victorian times, and then have a look at the number of children that are listed on those gravestones and how young they are. I mean, that is a very good indication, and then have a look at some modern graves. And the real difference there is these graves often contain families. The children are quite young when they died, and they inevitably died of infectious diseases, not just virus infections, but also other infectious diseases. And what has changed, why there is a difference, is entirely the result of the production of vaccines and vaccination. So that is one way of educating them. I mean, it's basically just explaining this is why this difference exists. You know, and I think it's really very difficult to argue with people who have an anti-vaccination mentality, but you have to illustrate these differences to them and let them come to their own conclusion with respect to, yes, see this as a very good example of the introduction of vaccination being extraordinarily helpful to really the survival of humans on this planet.
I think it was the Pfizer vaccine where there were a few cases of blood clotting. Why would something like that occur?
Not with Pfizer, no. That Pfizer does have side effects, but it's not blood clotting. So the blood clotting was seen as a very rare event with the AstraZeneca vaccine. And this was really unexpected in terms of anything that in the way of how this vaccine was developed. But it turns out that there's an antibody produced that interferes with a blood clotting factor, and that results in it, and very rare. It's less than 1 in 100,000 that you see this effect. Because it was unexpected, there was some panic initially. First of all, people didn't know how to detect it, and secondly, some deaths occurred as a result of this. But when you had a look at the number of deaths that occurred, it's around about 1 in a million, and the incidence is around about 1 in 100,000. It's a rare event, and now it's known how to detect this very early on. And it was seen. The other thing it was seen in younger populations, and this is why the advice is that when people under the age of 50 or younger are seeking to get a vaccination, if they get vaccinated with AstraZeneca, they should at least seek some medical advice around that. Talk to their GP, for example, or talk to a medical professional just to see if there's anything in their history that would potentially be an issue with respect to them getting that vaccine. Now, I think the issue in Australia was that when this occurred, we had very, very low rates of SARS-CoV-2 infection. And so, there was a balancing act there between, this was 1 in a million deaths. At that stage, it wasn't clear just what the death rate was, but it's about 1 in a million as a side effect of this vaccine. And yet we had almost no SARS-CoV-2. So, there was a sort of a risk established there, and some of the, I think there was some commentary around that, whereby it was better not to get vaccinated with AstraZeneca because your risk of dying from SARS-CoV-2 was less than the risk of dying from the vaccine. But, this has changed substantially now, and as I said, the risk is now recognized. It can be detected early if somebody's been vaccinated, and the risk of death from SARS-CoV-2 is much greater than the risk from vaccine.
With how viruses work, how effective are lockdowns?
With this particular virus, they're very effective because it was another bit of a delay in dealing with this outbreak was the realization that it was very effectively spread by aerosol, so rather than by droplet infection. So it was spread by tiny particles flying through the air from some significant difference. And this is why there was a debate about the wearing of masks early on, and there was a focus on hand washing and wiping down surfaces. So we now know that while we should still do those sorts of things, it's much more effective to have social distancing and mask wearing. Now, and that was fine with the earlier strains of the virus, but with the Delta strain, as I said, it's about 60% more infectious. Becomes a different situation. So lockdowns, we know, were very, very effective last year, and particularly in Victoria, in shutting down infection, although lockdowns have continued for a long time. It took a long time to get on top of that. For the Delta strain, we know that it's unless the lockdowns are applied very early, then the Delta strain has been able to overcome the lockdown situation, and that's very apparent now in New South Wales versus Victoria. In Victoria, the infection rates are still they're worrying, but they're still quite low. I think there's 80-odd cases the last couple of days per day, whereas New South Wales now over 1,000 cases per day. So it's lockdowns still need to be maintained, but the worry in New South Wales, and it has been the worry in Victoria as well, is that if the number of cases, can the healthcare system cope with the number of hospitalisations? That's where we still have to maintain, I think, lockdowns for some significant time. And there's a debate about when the lockdown should ease. Should it be 70% vaccination or 80% vaccination? I mean, I'd much prefer that if we're at 80% vaccination before we have easing of lockdowns. It's been a minor change in New South Wales, I think, despite the fact they had 1,000 cases. They're allowing some outdoor gatherings, from what I've read. I think what we've probably read as well, seen in the news. I don't think I wouldn't be doing that, but anyway, that's the decision of their health experts and politicians, and they'll have to live with the outcome.
Would the idea of a COVID passport be a solution to having less lockdowns?
So I think that's going to come anyway, and you could see that that's being rolled out in different workplaces. And it is mandated in some situations in the aged care sector. Now it's mandated for aged care workers, and I think you're going to see those mandates extended. And these mandates follow on from other mandates. For example, often healthcare organisations have mandates for seasonal flu vaccinations and other vaccinations for the staff, depending on what functions the staff perform. And then you're also seeing that there's been an announcement from Qantas, for example, that they want all their staff vaccinated. So I think you're going to see that's going to be driving vaccinations in a number of workplaces. And at the same time, I think what you're going to see is what has happened elsewhere, is that different venues are going to require vaccinations if you want to attend a particular function. That is what's happened in the UK. It's happening more and more in the US, where you've got to produce either evidence of vaccination or of having a recent COVID test within the last so many hours, 72 hours or something like that.
You're listening to Wellbeing, where we are discussing viruses and the COVID pandemic. My guest today is Professor Bryan Williams. Is COVID just the first of many pandemics to follow?
Peter Doherty has been a long proponent of, we're just sitting here waiting for the next pandemic. Now, we all thought it would have been flu. Now we know these coronaviruses are going to be with us for a long time. There are other viruses out there potentially, maybe not yet, but there are other viruses out there that could also spur a pandemic. So I think that if there's anything good that's come out of this particular pandemic, is that we're now going to be much better prepared. We now have new vaccine strategies, which is very, very welcome. I'm hoping that we'll have the development of antiviral drugs that are much more effective, particularly if given early on, and do not have attendant side effects. So I think there will be more pandemics. I think the bottom line is we're going to be much better prepared than we have been in the past. But having said that, we still have to get this current pandemic under control, and I think that we're getting to the stage of certainly dealing with it, if not effectively. We're sort of dealing with it in certain countries, mostly high-income countries, quite well, but we really need to be able to get the vaccines out to many other nations that do not have anything like the level of healthcare that we have. You can't have this particular virus circulating in countries, as I said, that don't have healthcare facilities that we enjoy, a healthcare system that we enjoy. You must get the vaccines out there and give these countries the ability to deal with the current pandemic.
What would be the take-home from this interview you'd want people to remember the most?
Well, first of all, get vaccinated. The other thing is promote the funding of research in Australia. We do not fund research to anything like the extent that our partners do in the US, Canada, the UK. The funding levels are woefully inadequate. The other thing that's become very apparent with the pandemic is the loss of international students. Now, what's that got to do with research funding? Well, those international students and the fees they paid underpin an enormous amount of research in the universities, and that's now gone. So I would encourage Australians to convince their politicians that they need to increase the research budget in Australia, and that will enable us to much better deal with any future, the current outbreak, but any future outbreaks.
Thank you for sharing your insight with us today, Bryan. We appreciate you taking the time.
Well, you're welcome, Jack, and I hope you're vaccinated, and if you're not, I encourage you to.
My guest today was Professor Bryan Williams, Research Group Head of Cancer and Innate Immunity at the Hudson Institute of Medical Research. Thank you for listening. I'm Jack Hodgins, and all of us at Wellbeing wish you well.